So our last market structure is oligopoly. Now this is another imperfectly competitive marketplace, but where monopolistic competition was closer to perfect competition, oligopolies are closer to monopolies. Because an oligopoly, like an oligarchy, just a few large, powerful businesses that dominate the marketplace. And with that, since they are just a few, they end up having a lot of market power. And they have to think about that market power and their competitors and think, how are they going to operate? Are they going to cooperate with the other producers, or are they going to operate in their own self-interest? You see both of these, but cooperation tends to be more illegal in America, because if you're cooperating with the few other large producers, you end up just acting like a monopoly. You see these in industries that are pretty common in America. I have airlines here. I know there's a lot listed there, but when you think about the airlines that dominate the industry, there are only a handful. And same with insurance companies and phone companies and cereal. There's only really Kellogg's and General Mills. A few large, powerful companies dominate the industries. And a lot of those that I listed are the ones that get advertised to people the most heavily, because these large players are trying so hard to get customers into their door instead of their competitors. Now, they are more of a price maker than a price taker, because again, they're as close to a monopoly as they're legally allowed to be. And so because of that, that idea of setting the price higher than perfect competition still applies. However, in a monopoly, there's just one. In an oligopoly, they still have competitors that they constantly have to think about how those competitors are behaving. Because there's so few, whatever the competitor does ends up affecting the selling price and output for the entire market. So the huge interdependence between these firms is a very common AP question over oligopolies. They are very interdependent, because this decision of one of what price and what output to sell will make a huge impact in the other businesses in that marketplace. So their products are similar, are identical, and we see this. They might have slight product differences like monopolistic competition. Their best option in terms of profit and total revenue would be to operate like a monopolist, to cooperate with the other competitors. But the thing with that is it's illegal in America. So you might see them try and work together, but if it gets to where they're actually merging together, you see the government step in to shut them down. And the other problem with working together is a lot of times the businesses will say they'll work together, but if their best interest is to not actually cooperate, a lot of times in oligopolies you see them say they'll do one thing and end up doing something completely different, because it's in their own self-interest. That's a common theme with oligopolies. Like, yes, you can talk about agreeing with one another, but you have to remember, if someone has a strategy that's going to be better for them that's not working with you, most likely they're going to follow that strategy that's best for them. So self-interest wins out a lot in oligopolies. So the most common form, and the one we're going to look at with game theory, is duopoly. So it's two businesses, and with the two businesses you can look at decisions just based on how those two interact. So it kind of simplifies oligopolies down to just the choices of two. And if they do decide to work together, and this isn't just for duopoly, this is for all oligopolies, if they do decide to work together and set prices and set output, this is known as collusion. And the formal organization that colludes is called a cartel. And you've heard the term cartel before, probably drug cartels, which are illegal, of course, cartels, but then they're not necessarily illegal worldwide. Drug cartels are, but you see OPEC. OPEC, this oil cartel, is 12 countries working together to set prices and set output of oil. They are a legal cartel in the countries that are a part of OPEC, and they collude. So I always think of it as cartels are the group that colludes. In America, collusion and cartels make them act like a monopoly, which eliminates competition. So we don't allow collusion and cartels in America. If the oligopolist decides to not collude, to work on their own self-interest, then it's going to make them not a true price level of a monopoly, it's going to set their price a little bit lower than a monopoly and their quantity a little bit greater than a monopoly, which makes them closer to monopolistic competition, but not as low of a price as perfect competition. So it puts them again in that middle between the two extremes. So their profits end up being less than a monopolist profit. But since cooperation very rarely works in these industries, this is where we tend to see them fall in that category of self-interest. So I mentioned game theory. This is where it comes in. Because if you have a duopoly, if you have two businesses, two countries, two individuals, and two decisions that they can make, you can actually measure what decision these people or businesses should make. So we're going to look at game theory to show why businesses and people sometimes cooperate and sometimes don't. Sometimes follow their best interest and sometimes follow what's best with overall. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And since an oligopoly is a few large industries, this is the marketplace that can look at game theory. The first thing with game theory is, does the oligopolist have a dominant strategy? This is key. This is the first thing you look at every time you see a game theory problem. Do they have a dominant strategy? This means no matter what anyone else is going to do, they have one thing that makes them more profit no matter what. So this is if you will make more profit whether the other person sells or doesn't sell the item. So this dominant strategy tells you that if one person in the duopoly has a dominant strategy, you know how all the decisions are going to work out. And if two people have a dominant strategy, they're both always going to follow that dominant strategy. And with this, if you know at least one of the players has a dominant strategy, you can figure out where on the chart I'm about to show you, you will end up producing. Because even if, let's say, that Russia does not have a dominant strategy, but America does, America is going to follow that no matter what. And if Russia knows that they have that dominant strategy, and that means Russia knows how America is going to behave, Russia will behave according to our dominant strategy. So this is called Nash Equilibrium. It's the idea that if at least one of the groups has a dominant strategy, we know exactly how the game's going to play out because we know what they're going to do and we can behave accordingly. So I have the example here that if you know no matter what, your classmate's going to cheat on the final exam. And if you know this, and let's say that they curve it and you know that their grade's going to be higher, you're going to behave according to the knowledge of their dominant strategy, that they're going to cheat no matter what. Within that Nash equilibrium, we have a more specific example called the prisoner's dilemma. So the prisoner's dilemma, they got it from like Bonnie and Clyde and prisoners having to either confess or stay silent when being interrogated and what their best option is. To be a prisoner's dilemma, you have to have two things. You have to have each player having a dominant strategy, and those dominant strategies not being the best thing overall. And what this does is it shows that idea that I was just saying, that people will follow their best interest over cooperation, because if it's in my best interest, if I have a dominant strategy to always do one thing, why would I cooperate with the other person? So this is that idea of self-interest getting in the way of cooperation. So this is what I was saying, it has to have two things to fit into this. So if it doesn't have both of these, it cannot be a prisoner's dilemma. So it could still be Nash equilibrium and not a prisoner's dilemma. To be Nash equilibrium, you have to have one dominant strategy. You can have two, but you have to have at least one. To be a prisoner's dilemma, you have to have both players having a dominant strategy. And because of that, and they both follow that dominant strategy, the second rule is the best overall is not their dominant strategy. And I'm going to show you examples of this to see what I mean, because it has to fit into both of these to be a prisoner's dilemma. So this is where they came out with the idea of a prisoner's dilemma with Bonnie and Clyde is the most typical example you see, to where they can either confess or remain silent. And if you notice, if they both remain silent, they get the smallest sentencing overall. However, if they both confess, they both get 8. But if Bonnie confesses and Clyde remains silent, then Bonnie goes free and Clyde gets 20 years. And if Clyde confesses and Bonnie remains silent, he goes free and she gets 20 years. So the problem with this is obviously the best overall for them to both remain silent. And they may go in the door saying that to each other, like, we will not confess. But if your dominant strategy is to confess because going free is better than the 1 year, they're going to both end up confessing. That self-interest will get in the way. And if they both end up confessing, this is where their equilibrium ends up being, meaning that their choice that they decide on by following their dominant strategy is not the best overall. So that's showing that this is the perfect example of a prisoner's dilemma. They both have a dominant strategy to confess, but that dominant strategy, when they follow it, is not the best thing overall. I have a modern example based on our times, but it is so relevant going on right now as I'm going to the grocery store and trying to buy things. So I have people hoarding toilet paper during a pandemic. Very, very close to everyone's hearts right now. So I have me and a panicked citizen. If we both hoard up toilet paper, grocery stores start limiting how much we can get, and we can only get 1 roll a piece. If both of us purchase normally, then we can each get 20 rolls a piece because they're not selling out because not everyone's hoarding up. If I hoard and the panicked citizen purchases normally, I get 30 rolls and they get nothing. And then opposite, if they hoard and I purchase normally, they get 30 rolls and I get nothing. So it shows that idea of obviously the best scenario would be for us to just purchase our toilet paper at a normal rate that the stores are stocked up for. Yet, our dominant strategy is to hoard toilet paper, because 1 is still better than 0 that I might lose out because that panicked citizen bought up toilet paper and freaked out. So because of that, our dominant strategies make us to this point, which is what we're seeing in the real world, that we are not at the best outcome overall, and we're only buying 1, and that's a perfect example of another prisoner's dilemma. I have more in the notes, so if you need more examples, you can go through the notes. But with an oligopolist, the last thing I want to talk about is the problem that if they do cooperate and they're acting essentially like a monopoly, yes, it's better for them because their profits are higher, but that gets rid of competition and makes them act like a monopoly. So we have laws in place to break up businesses that are becoming too powerful in an oligopoly market and prevent mergers from happening that keep businesses from getting too strong. And also, these firms do not like new competition. So one thing we see them doing is this idea of price wars, where they make it almost impossible for new firms to come into the industry by, let's say, a new airline enters into the industry. And they say that their quality's better, so the other airlines raise their quality as well to make it exactly equal, but the other airline's more established. The new airline has high startup costs. So what the existing airline is going to do is not only set the quality equal, but cut the price, because that forces, in this limited market, this new airline to cut the price as well, which then the existing airline will cut the price again until the new airline is driven out of business, because they can't exist at this new business at this high startup cost with that low of a price. So the government steps in sometimes to keep this from happening, to keep collusion from happening, and to keep mergers from happening that make the markets too powerful. We have 2 ways of measuring an oligopoly market. One is if it's in an oligopoly, which is the 4-firm concentration ratio, and the second one is measuring how much power individual firms have in that. And that kind of is the way the government can see, okay, are they becoming too close to a monopoly? You won't have to calculate these, but you will need to know the definitions of them. So we have the 4-firm concentration ratio. This shows that if the 4 largest firms in the market have 40% of the market or more, it's considered an oligopoly. So this is where I said, yes, there are a lot of airlines, but a few of them dominate the marketplace. That's why they're considered an oligopoly. Same thing with, like, yes, I know there are a ton of tiny cell phone companies, but a few of them really control a huge majority of the market, and that's what still makes them an oligopoly. The other one is to measure how much percentage of market power does a firm have. This is to show how much individual firms actually have in terms of power in an industry. So it not only just says percentage, but it actually squares the percentage. And by doing that, you can see how one firm, if you square it, actually has much greater power in an industry than it may look at like just looking at the market power. So those are the two ways we look at market power in an oligopoly. But again, just know the definition. Don't break it down more than that. All right, guys, now that is oligopoly. You're going to be practicing game theory problems, which are fun. Make sure to follow the rules I laid out with Nash Equilibrium and Prisoner's Dilemma, and have a wonderful day.